the chess. We had a question, what do you do with Bobby Fischer? And I lost because I said we should publish the letter he sent to us. Because that in and of itself was a historic document as to why he refused to be identified as Jewish. By the way, we had other issues. Any number of people who were christened Jewish in the first encyclopedia turned out not to have been, but they were actually christened Christians. And we had a range of people, and here's where you talk about divisions. Look, you have lots of people who may be Jewish in either halachic senses or in lahavdil elef alfei havdalot, in the sense of the Nuremberg laws, who see themselves within the context of a Jewish discourse and a Jewish debate, and many of them who have achieved international prominence are included with that being indicated. With that being indicated, and that's the only responsible way to do. And in terms of divisions, I am not 100% certain that you can make the statement you made, and I say this in friendship and respect, and there's nothing, that you can make the statement you made really objectively as a historical statement. Meaning that the Seders, in which you had an ultra-Orthodox father with 4 sons who have gone in different directions and multiple daughters, and then the people who were not at the Seder because nobody was talking to each other, and the Bundist and the Communist and the intermarried and the Socialist and the Maskil and the Chassid and the Litvak. I mean, all of these people came out of the same thing. Look, we tell a great story. The great story of the Slovakian Jewish resistance. You had the cooperation between a Zionist woman and an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. The reality is that they were cousins. And therefore, because she was cousins with Gysi Fleischman was cousins with the father-in-law, she could walk into the Beis Medrash and grab Michael Weissmandel out from the Beis Medrash and put him in a room alone. He would never be in a room alone with another woman alone, yell at him, scream at him, and what came out, and he'd scream back. And what came out of that was great cooperation on resistance in Slovakia, and effective operation that even led to the request to bomb Auschwitz. Now, those were serious divisions, right? But they were family. So I'm less confident than you are about divisions. Now, don't ask me about how we dealt with anti-Semitism, because it changes before our eyes every day, and whatever you write yesterday is out of date tomorrow. But ask me other things. Yes, sir.
Sorry, there was a question here.
Okay.
Joe Vernick, then Francois Houzat.
Moni, I wanted to ask you about, you said things are frozen already. In other words, is there any thought on what's being followed up when we talk about, we know the other one had the yearbooks and other things?
That's a very good question. We're now in economic discussions. We're now in economic discussions over whether we can begin to issue byproducts. If you remember, in the old days, there were a series of byproducts of this, multiple books that came out of this. The problem with all of this is the combination of an American partner that is transitioning, an Israeli public corporation, and by the way, I'm not telling you economic things, but I can tell you something else. Because you're dealing with with 2 public corporations, the number of both of them were down to 0 encyclopedias on December 31st, 2006, and they reprinted literally the next day because they didn't want to have to declare something as inventory on their balance sheet. Now, I can tell you how much this drives authors nuts, because what do you mean you can't get me an encyclopedia for X number of days? But That's the economic reality of the show. There are byproducts that should come out of this. There is certainly a children's encyclopedia that should come out of it. The question, I'll give you one touch on anti-Semitism because I had that conversation last night. There's an interesting division in Iran today, in which the president does not enjoy the total support of his people. There's evidence that there are cracks. The question becomes, what resources should be made available in Farsi and by whom? Should it have a .il website or not a .il website? But what is most effective to enable those who want to know to get empowered to know, and what would be regarded as an authoritative source and the like? That's a significant contribution, a significant priority for any number of people to make available. The other thing about it is I want them to make enough money so that they can commit themselves to the rubric of the staff. And believe me, I'm not looking for a job. And believe me, this was the least well paid I've been in 30 years for anything. For anything I've done. I might as well have done it virtually pro bono. But having said that, I am trying that they make enough profit that we can commit them for rubrics, so we keep the web thing dynamic, because even in the dates of people alive and dead, you get that. By the way, I want to tell a wonderful story, which is I called someone up who has subsequently died to check on a death date at 103 years of age. Guy answered his own phone and said, "What makes you think I died?" So after I got my foot out of my mouth, I said, "Tell me, what's the secret to your longevity?" He said, "I walk 3 miles a day. It used to take me 45 minutes, and now it takes me the bulk of the morning. But I walk 3 miles every day." And he said, "I advise that." So, I'm a wonderful Jewish educator, and again, I never asked that question again. But I couldn't find, man was 103 years old, I couldn't find the date, I couldn't find the date of death. Couldn't find it, I couldn't find it on, in American death records, couldn't find it in Israeli death records. There was a very simple reason, he hadn't died. Yes, sir.
No, sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'll do it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed your lecture, and hope that I haven't missed the question I actually want to ask you. First, the concept of Americanization of the Holocaust has been attributed to you, at least among French scholars, and has entailed a lot of controversy. Do you still use it? Do you still legitimate it? And has this concept evolved?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Aleph et chatotaya maskira. For those who don't speak Hebrew, you're reminding me of my iniquity. I did introduce the Americanization of the Holocaust. Michael Rosenak, who is a wonderful educational scholar here, and I have to say has given me the legitimacy for this concept, but he didn't do it for me. I have one of the great things you have in life is I have a doctoral student who's writing a good deal on Rosenak's thing. In order to guide my doctoral student, I've had to read Rosenak, who was a great hero of mine because he was the first person from my hometown who went on Aliyah in the 50s, when that was and was an astounding thing. He gave a wonderful concept called partial translation. And that is that you have to translate Jewish things into universal terms, but if you translate them fully, then there's no reason for them to remain Jewish. And if you translate them partially, then you understand where they differ and where they do it. What I argued for in my work all the way through, and what I did in the Holocaust Museum, was to say that, and I'll give it to you, Al Narot Bavel Sham Yashavnu V'gam Bachinu B'Zochreinu Eksion. On the waters, rivers of Babylon, we sat and we wept as remembered Zion. The place from which you remember an event shapes how you remember it. And therefore, to remember the Holocaust from the shores of the Potomac is different from doing it in Auschwitz, is different from doing it in Jerusalem. And we had to translate the elements of the Holocaust into a language that resonated with the basic mythoses of the American people. And I want to say something that Yad Vashem has done nothing less with their own presentation of the Shoah to Jerusalem than to do it for the second generation, the Israelification of it. And all I can argue, and we can spend hours arguing this, is that there is legitimacy as long as you don't misrepresent, as long as you don't de-Judaize, as long as you don't trivialize, and whatever have you. And I can defend, in whatever form you want, this is not the form, I can defend virtually all of the decisions that we made on that. I might even say that I would continue to agree with about 95% of the decisions we made in doing that. And let me give you a very simple example. In Washington, we did not present, for example, and I look at Ambassador Minerby, we did not present the churches as strongly as we presented the American government. We didn't deal with the responsibility of the Roman Catholic Church in the same way that you might want to, as we did with the responsibility of the American government as a bystander to genocide. I think in Washington, D.C., that's legitimate. In a total history of the Holocaust, that might not be legitimate enough, but presenting a museum in Washington, D.C., where you want American action with regard to genocide, I think that's a legitimate decision. I think anybody in my position would have made a similar decision. So I defend it, I stand by it, and we can discuss it and the like. But Rosenack has given me this wonderful vocabulary, partial translation, because it means you make it accessible, you make it available, and you make it part and parcel of the experience that the visitor can get. And I'll give you one example of. I had this discussion with Avner Shalev, and I, in fact, yelled at him in the way in which professional colleagues respectfully yell. I said, if I were in your position, I would have broken. He had a rule that you did nothing post-Holocaust with it. But the idea that the film on anti-Semitism does not have a copy of the Pope's letter that was issued at Yad Vashem, the easiest way to diffuse some of the strong critiques by believing Christians as to what happens there is to present the Pope's letter, imperfect as it is. It happened at Yad Vashem, it's authentic to the place, and all of a sudden it begins to say that Christianity must assume responsibility for the behavior of Christians. I would have preferred if he had said the behavior of Christianity, but in a million years as director of Yad Vashem, it would have taken all the king's horses and all the king's men to keep me from putting that letter in. And I said, yell with everybody, rules are made, and for those of you who are devoutly Orthodox, forgive me, I don't mean this religiously, certain rules are made to be broken. That's why Pikuach Nefesh Docha Shabbat. But certain rules are made to be broken on certain very important occasions. That's one example of where an Israelification would allow the Christian to hear something else on the film on anti-Semitism, precisely because the Pope said, John Paul II said what he said and did what he did.
We take two more questions, Larry Pfeffer and Ambassador Dr. Joseph Kovlin.
First question is, you mentioned the encyclopedia being cast onto paper, into books, and cast onto bits, into the digital world. What kind of innovations are taking place in terms of user interface for the second casting? For example, do you have any tools for effective time-space navigation, like Google Earth? The second question is, it's a bit more difficult. You spoke about controversy and presenting both sides of the topic. You also mentioned that Nachum Goldman was the founder of the encyclopedia. When you were in the museum and also now in the encyclopedia, how did you deal with the topic of rescue? People like Peter Bergson, for example, who turned America upside down to save Jews, who are not represented in the museum to date. And people like Nachum Goldman went to the State Department to sabotage rescue.
Well, Peter Bergson, we had an article by Raphael Medoff, who I had to tone down a little bit of his Bergson article, because he was Bergson. He co-wrote with David Wyman the book on the oral history on Peter Bergson, and what I had to tone it down in the sense is I wanted to present why Bergson was controversial. And I don't think you can fairly represent Bergson without understanding how controversial he was and how irritating he was to the American Jewish community. And that doesn't take, that's not bichut kvodo, it doesn't take away, but you must present the whole thing. And you know, the reality is, the more we know, sometimes the more controversy seems more complex. Let me give you, I'm going to change the subject, but let me give you one very interesting example, and where my thinking changed by the discovery of a document. Ordinarily, one would have thought that Auschwitz was not bombed because of anti-Semitism. And if somebody had said that, you could have accepted that. The problem is that there was a June 11th decision in 1944, a decision by the Jewish Agency, not to request the bombing of Auschwitz. In this audience, I would presume most of you would agree that David Ben-Gurion was not an anti-Semite. Right? Reasonable assumption for one to make that his motivations were other than anti-Semitism. On July 11th, 1944, you had a request, on July 7th, 1944, you had a request by Chaim Weizmann and Moshe Shertak, later Moshe Sharet, to bomb Auschwitz, made of Anthony Eden, who got Churchill's approval. Now, you then have to deal with the question, were they operating without instruction? Were they operating contrary to instruction? Or did a document arrive in Israel, in Palestine at that point, that changed the decision of June 11th, made it so non-operative that they didn't even have to convene a meeting and have minutes, and what could that document be? And I speculate that that document could be the Werber-Wetzler report on the bomb, which is the Auschwitz report, which gave specific examples, and that once you read that document, the idea that the Jews could not advocating the killing of innocent Jews on the ground, because that would be contrary to Jewish interests, became non-operative when you saw what was happening. So in the articles on this, we try to present the issues, and we try also to avoid, and I'm a good deal responsible for this, we try also to avoid the simplistic conclusions. It's a more complex conclusion, and the more you know, the more complex, which doesn't mean that mistakes, large mistakes, serious mistakes that involve human lives were not made, but we tried to present that in all sorts of ways. I did not write the article on Nachum Goldman during this period of time, and I'm straining now to recall what was said about Goldman's role during World War II. I can tell you more of what was said about Wise's role, but that's a different story. But I'm straining to remember it, and the reality is I could tell you something that is fictitious, but I'd rather read it and find out. Yes, sir.
No, look, let's not get arguments. Sorry.
The story is not represented, is it? even though the Bergson effort took place in the United States, Wallenberg was funded by the
No.
Holocaust
The story is represented in the it is represented in the Holocaust Museum. It's represented in the most miserable location in the museum, and in the one physical mistake in the museum. There are five-minute programs on America during the Holocaust that are adjacent to the final film. But the final, which is on the right-hand side, on the final floor of the museum, and the problem is that the final film is compelling. It's visually compelling into a theater. Nobody goes to the right. Nobody goes to the right to see the five-minute programs that are comparable to the 5-minute programs on the third floor. And we have to wait until the donor of the artwork on the second floor, he should live and be well to 120 years, leaves this earth. And then we can argue that the real place for the American response is at the beginning of the third floor, where we now have artwork or stuff that's presumed to be artwork. And that nobody knows what goes there. But it's an example of where the material is there, and it's terrific. It is seen by 2% of the visitors because its location is bad. So I don't accept that it's not there, because it is there, but only 2% of its visitors do it. Next time you're in Washington, go there and don't go to the film, and you'll be, I think, reasonably pleased by what you see.
Final question, Yosef.
In the last 35 years, particularly, it seems to me, in the last 10 or 15 years, there is the number of memoirs written about the Holocaust by the survivors has immensely increased. I do think that we all presume that the number of these memoirs will certainly be decreased in the coming 10 or 15 years. My question is, to what extent do the authors of these testimonies, which are historical documents, are being presented, either the authors or the places of their descriptions? To what extent are they represented
Okay.
in the encyclopedia?
Thank you very much for asking the question. I'm going to answer that in two ways. I'm going to answer that with Izzy here, because there's one urgent project that the Claims Conference should fund, which is really a relatively cheap project, but is the following. All Holocaust memoirs should be gathered in one place. All Holocaust memoirs that are unpublished by commercial publishers should be gathered in one place, should be cataloged, and we should have them for what they call print on demand.
In all languages?
In all languages, print on demand, which is what, for example, the University of Michigan does with PhD dissertations. So that and the Yiddish Book Center does, the National Yiddish Book Center, and Amherst does with Yiddish books. So that you have all this material in one place, cataloged and as closely as humanly possible, giving you the basic outlines of the story, so that if you're researching an area, you can access this material. This is relatively cheap. It would answer the question of every survivor, which is, if I write my memoir, how will it be made available to the public? It is the only way we're going to get access to these types of memoirs in all of the languages, and contemporary technology is going to make this cheaper and cheaper and more and more and more able. And believe me, I say this at every board meeting I attend at the Claims Conference, and I'm lobbying one man in this room, but I'll lobby anybody else. I think this is the greatest honor we can pay to that generation, is to make sure that their material is available for publication. And I think it should begin with the thing, the views here are the views of the author and not of any institution. We cannot verify all of this, and et cetera, et cetera. And we should have it all in one place so that everybody could hear it. We represent survivors' testimonies, we represent survivors' memoirs, We try as much as the individuals. Look, we have a representation of all of the villages, towns, and hamlets in which Jews live. But remember, the Shoah was only one small part of that life. And we try to represent some of the great Rabbanim, some of the great community leaders, some of the enterprises, some of the things. So we cannot do enough, but again, it's the beginning, it's not the end. Knowledge is evolving, but also believe me that we have the contemporary technology to make this material available literally inexpensively, and it should be done. Yad Vashem took, look, I'm criticizing the Holocaust Museum, I can also, Yad Vashem had a $1 million grant from Random House through Wiesel, in which they decided to put into writing 12 or 15 or 18 memoirs, whatever have you. They could have taken that $1 million, gathered every memoir, made it available by buying the technology, by scanning, and make it available for self-publishing, for publishing on demand. For $20, you could have gotten a copy of everything, and every survivor who had taken the trouble to write could do it. I cannot tell you the number of people who turn to me day in, day out for assistance in publication. And, you know, to read manuscripts and all of that. I probably have 200 entries now of introductions to these books by people that I know well, whom I'm not in a position to say no to. And that's not an invitation for me to get more, but it's just, it's one of the things that you do because of your position, which is you empower these people to tell their story. Thank you very much.